Hey, what's good? Good to be with you. My name is Jeff Fuller, Jay Fuller Interviews, Jay Fuller Interviews on YouTube. You can certainly subscribe so you don't miss this interview. You can catch up on others and certainly find the ones coming up in the future. And also the Facebook group, Jay Fuller Interviews. We're on Instagram and Twitter. And joining me now is Chris Lamica. Chris, great to have you on.
Thank you for having me, Jeff. Appreciate it, brother.
So, man, I like the hair, and in this picture behind me, you always kind of had that flow. Talk to me a little bit. How did you find your way up to Johnson State?
Oh, wow. So, let's see. That's a long story. I'll give you the short version. 7th and 8th grade, got cut from my school team. They told me I was too short and I should try something else. At that time, Jason Williams, Allen Iverson came in the league and started taking over. So I got wild and just shaved the head. And I'm like, I'm never going to let somebody ever tell me I'm not good enough to do what I love again. Fast forward through high school. I grew up in a small town, didn't have much money, didn't go to camp, stuff like that growing up. And when I was 16, my uncle got me into the SUNY Potsdam basketball camp.
Yeah.
Northern New York, went up there. Coach was super intrigued by what I could do with the ball, that I always had it in my hands. And, at the night we would play with the team, the best kids at the camp playing the team.
Sure.
And I started realizing I might be able to do this, and so they kept in contact with me and wanted me up there. So I went up there freshman year, just after doing the M1 mixtape tour thing. And
sure.
So M1 offered me to keep going with them. I decided to go to college instead because I'd lose eligibility if I did M1 because they're considered pro.
Yeah.
So did that, went to Potsdam, started, one of my first few games. At the time, my grandparents lived a few towns over. That was one of the main reasons why I went there, and they passed away within 2 weeks of each other. And that just, led me down a road where, stopped really caring about things, stopped going to classes, still super dedicated to basketball, but I became academically ineligible. Next year, I'm, motivated to kind of prove to myself, you're not that guy who, gives up on himself. And, I had one of my homies come up to school with me, and coach, 2 days before cuts took me in, and he's like, Chris, we still have the same vision for you, but, cuts aren't going to work out with, with this friend of yours, we don't see a spot for him. And then young 19-year-old me, I'm super arrogant. I'm like, no, I did AM1, I'm on ESPN. I put in this work. You're this isn't going to happen, And then, cuts came and they're like, we're not keeping him. And, I'm just I can't do this without this guy who came up and, my best friend from growing up. And a few weeks go by and I'm like, man, I don't know if that was the right decision. And so I hit up my uncle who lives in Vermont. Actually, he's one of the winningest coaches up there, coached at St. Albans, Ken Fairchild. And he's like, I got this school, Johnson State. He's like, you would walk in, be one of the better players. He's like, but let me tell you, this is a different world. He's like, you're used to growing up outside of Albany and AAU tournaments all over down in the city and whatnot. And he's like, this is a different world. And I went, visited Johnson, and I'm like, it's different, but I kind of fell in love with the environment. It was way different. Not that I'm from, I'm from a small town, but small town Vermont is different than small town everywhere else. And in the most beautiful of ways,
Yeah.
And so transferred to Johnson. Transferred mid-year. So wasted a year of eligibility on 6 games, not even. And then my freshman year at Potsdam, I started a few games or whatever, but academically ineligible. And, so I basically lost 2 years before I got to Johnson. And and then I remember after that first semester, the coach left and Coach Osborne came on. And we're at the summer camp, and he every time Oz and I get together, we joke about the story, but he brought this point guard up. And I think he was like from Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, New York, somewhere like that. And he's like giving him like the king's treatment, right, bro? He's like arm around him in front of the whole team. Like, this is the leader we need. This is a point guard. He's recruited by all these big schools, but he can really be like the guy who changed this program. And so I turned to Jesse Courtrai. I don't know if you're familiar with him. I wasn't at the time. And I just look at him like, I'm going to start this year and I'm going to make sure this kid doesn't come back to school here. And so that like day of like pickup with everybody, I was just hardcore going at this kid. And, you know, then Oz always says like from that moment, he knew like I was his guy. And yeah, so that kind of put my track to Johnson. Yeah.
So I always start out by sharing. I knew Bob Shed real well since he was in junior high school and just a great kid. But he told me about, hey, we have this new player. He played with the And One mix tour and all this stuff. You got to check him out. Honestly, I don't know if I made it up for a game or a couple games with him. But when I think about that transition, playing And One to playing D3 at Johnson, was that a hard transition for you as some of the rules, showmanship kind of go away when you're playing for Coach Oz?
Yes and no. I think the best thing basketball wise that ever happened to me was growing up without much, you know, financial ability to go to camp. So everything I was taught was a kind of self-taught from the And One mixtapes, from, you know, Jason Williams, these guys I was talking about. And so I didn't know any different. And, you know, through high school and college, I was always, you know, a riff. Like, coach, like, oh, if you would just tone it down. And, you know, Oz and I got to talking one time. I'm like, I'm up there in assist to turnover ratio. Like, I'm not doing these things just to be a show off. Like, I'm doing these things because, you know, this is how I play. This is the passion. Like, I've always just been in love with the creativity of the game, more so than almost any other sport. And I'm like, if I'm have 5-6 turnovers a game, like, put me on the bench, like, and I'll take it into account. But it's like, I always viewed it as like a chip on my shoulder, being so undersized, being from the country, like without much money. And I'm like, you know, I got to where I am through like having the offer to play on one, going to a bigger school and like all this stuff. And I'm like, I'm not willing to change because I'm passionate that I'm playing the game the right way. And yeah, I mean, Oz and I, like, I would be lying if I said we always saw like eye to eye on things, but you know, I love him to death. He's the only coach I ever had for more than 1 year throughout my entire playing career. And him, and then especially Coach Eck, I know you had him on and saw that interview. And he and I, my senior year, shared this moment, and I won't like go into super detail about like what was said because it was like highly personal, but it was the first time I felt like seen by a coach and like understood as like a person, instead of like, oh, he's this like wild, like rogue on the court who's just a show off, who does anything for attention. Like, Eck saw me for like the competitor like that I am and the amount of work that it takes to do this. And he kind of, you know, going into like a pro career, that talk with him, like, still to this day, like, moves me, and was one of the reasons why I'm like, you know, I can go forward with this. And, you know, one of the happiest days as far as basketball goes was seeing him getting the head coaching job at Johnson for the girls. Because I mean, if there's ever a man that's put on this earth to coach, I believe it's him. You know, he's just him and Coach Oz, both phenomenal people.
Yeah, great guys. I think it was Billy Packer during the March Madness tournament when Chris Webber threw a no-look or a behind-the-back pass. That's what it was. And Billy Packer said, it's not fancy if it's effective. And I think sometimes that sleight of hand, that was my go-to. And I always blame my other guys because they didn't know it was coming. And it was my turnover.
Yeah, hey, bro. I remember, like, speaking of Eck, we were playing at Castleton. We were down like one with just over a minute to play. I get a steal on the wing, and I'm on this 2-on-1 break, and I have Charlie Vanna like trailing me, and their big like comes over to like cut me off, and I just go up and like kind of do this like dump behind the back and just like run it out because I knew like Charlie was my man. I knew he was finishing, And so they call a timeout. We're going crazy. Me takes me. He's like, you drive me crazy. He's like, but I love you. And I was like, I mean, I think that's the like. But you're 100% right. Like if you're not hurting the team, you know, I don't see, because you can create angles with you know, different style passes where a chest pass, bounce pass from the pocket might not be, you know, the best bet there. And that's why, you know, those guys, you know, even Steve Nash, Jason Kidd, all these guys, it's like, I feel they really piggybacked off like the Pete Maraviches, the Bob Cousy's, who it's like, no, the game doesn't have to be like you're in this box. Like a little 5'10", like white kid from the sticks can be effective in like a pro league because I can bring other things to the table just as much as, you know, a 7'1" guy who just bangs down low can. Right. And that's what's beautiful about basketball, man. And that's one thing I love about your show. You know, I've gone through some of your interviews and it's like you're interviewing all these players and everybody has such a different story and so impactful. I mean, like you had Miles on and he was saying just like how different of a player, you know, he was like, oh, I averaged 3 points, 3 assists, him. And it's like he could impact the game just as much as, say, like you talked about Bob, who could put up, you know, 20 to 30 a game. And it's like everybody's equally as important. And it's just like, to me, that's the beautiful thing about basketball is like the creativity and just the ability to influence it.
Oh, definitely. And it teaches you a lot about life and roles. And when you have that moment, just to really seize that opportunity. Basketball question for you, being a guard, the hardest thing for me to teach as a coach, as a former guard, is vision. How would you coach vision to a young point guard?
So, okay, great. So I like I said, I can only go based off what I know, but this is like, this excites me. Like this talk, like, so like growing up, one thing like I always like had access to was like garbage pails and like, you know, hay bales and all this stuff. So what I would always do is I would set up, you know, different height obstacles with like really specific marks and, you know, then things in the way. And as I would drive, I'd have my little brother who's like 3 years younger than me, who he came up to Johnson for a year and played, which was a magical year. But and I would have him just like point to a direction, and then I would try to hit like the mark, and he would like point and have his hand like at different levels. And you know, I think that you know, growing up, my best sport actually was like football, and so not wanting to get hit, you're always kind of just picking things up on the fly. And you know, I think a lot of it came from the fact of like the people I idolized, even like Iverson, like he was a great passer, but like, you know, like I talked about Jason Williams, Jason Kidd, like Steve Nash, it's like they could really influence the game so from a young age, like I didn't want to go out and get buckets. Like I wanted to go out and get people easier shots and create. So I think just trying to simulate that as much as you can. And then also I think it comes down to like mindset. Like, you know, of course the sexy thing is getting the 30 like Steph or whatever, but it's like, there's always a place for a Rajon Rondo in the league. You know, there's always a place for Alonzo Ball now. It's like these guys, like if you don't have to be like everybody, because if you're not a top 3%, not even if you're not a top 2% shooter in this country, you're probably not going to college to play. You know, but if you have handles and you can create for other people, and or like Miles, like if you can just be a ferocious lockdown defender, it's like there's a place for you. And like you're talking with Eck, you know, the script, you ripped him for winning that MVP award, and it's like, you know, but he can influence the game by setting screens and all this stuff. So it's like, you know, I think kids need to, from a younger age, realize like, you know, like yes, you have to be able to shoot, that's essential, but if you're not the greatest shooter, there's other ways to love the game.
I certainly agree with that. And especially guard play, it's so important to get your bigs touches to make sure everybody feels involved, whether they're scoring or whether they're not. Just guard play. I really think that teaching vision, it comes with a mindset like yours to be creative, but also to understand the offense where players are supposed to go. And I think film study is big, where kids can go back and say, oh, that's where they're rolling. That's what they're doing. Were you a basketball junkie, or was that just something you did on the side?
Nah, junkie like through and through. I used to harass Oz in college, like the night of. I'm like, I need this game tape.
Yeah.
Like, you know, and and it was never to be like, oh, I had this assist, like I had this highlight, I had this blah blah blah. It was more of like those moments, like those 2 to 3 minutes where it was like I was on the court but wasn't like not ineffective but not effective. Like
right.
What happened to me from a mental spot? Like physically, did I miss a roller? Or like, if I would, if a player of mine missed a layup, like, okay, did I not give him in the idea? Like knowing Bob, like, he was much better at finishing when the ball's high, whether it's an oop or even a high release. So it's just boom.
Yeah.
Here, where other big man, like I played with it, I'm going to use Johnson people just so you're familiar with them.
Sure.
Like John Foley, it's like, he needed it lower because he was more of like a power guy.
Right.
So just those like nuances, like I've always been obsessed with, and like, going back to being a kid, just understanding like those aspects of the game. And I felt like it made my obsession go from like really obsessed to when I got cut, did all that jazz, to where it was like, I'm spending these hours. I'm spending 6-7 hours just dribbling, figuring out stuff that I can do that other people can't. And, just really trying to get a feel. So it's been an obsession with mine since I was, young. And so people out here that meet me as like an actor, it's like, I didn't get into acting until I was done my pro career. Like I wasn't in a school play. I wasn't, I wasn't anything. Like I wasn't in a 5th grade play. Like I wasn't in nothing like that. And, basketball is my passion. It still is. Like I'm fortunate enough to be able to do like commercials and stuff like that, and show my hoop skill every now and again. And it's just always a passion of mine. And I think, as you were kind of alluding to, it's like sports definitely like shapes who you are as a person. Like, you know what I mean? So now being away from the game for some years, it's like, the lessons I learned there of like things I was successful with in basketball, or even things like I was like, oh, I should have done that differently. It's like, that level of passion, drive is not common in most people. So I if I was ever in a position to hire people, I would be like, did you play sports growing up?
Yeah.
Team sports specifically, and like go from there. I mean, you know it, man. Like sports people are a different breed.
Oh, so true. And you were good enough and fortunate enough to play after college. What was that like? And then when you were named an ABA All-Star, I can only imagine there was a sense of pride that you had made it from where you come from, those humble beginnings.
Yeah. So it's kind of a weird journey to the ABA. So after the end of my senior year, I'm like, I'm not ready to give this up. I'm like, I need to find, because really I only had 2 years of playing in college because my first 2 years. And I'm like, I think less than like 70 games or something like that, 60 games. And I'm like, I've worked way too hard just to let this go. And so I was talking to Oz about it, and he was like, he did like the Globetrotters thing for a minute, but he was on like the team that got smacked by the Globetrotters. Okay. And he was like, I think you might be. I'm like, Coach, I'm not touring and getting smacked by anybody. Right. And he's like, no. Like, I think you could, like, he would always joke, like, one of his favorite things was like my warm up before the game was just, and so you actually have the picture up right there. They, it's like this Globetrotter type team that tour the country, like reach out to me. They're like, hey, I saw you were on AM1, like followed your college career. Like, will you come out? And they're a Harlem team based out of Fort Collins, Colorado, but just because it's center of the country, you can travel all over, and I went out there, and played with, everybody was D1, everybody was former pro overseas, dunk champions, all these sort of things. And I'm like, this small guy that was born in a trailer, and like I'm out here, and so we started the tour in Indiana and kind of did like a circle for the first like 4 months around the country. And it was like a magical experience, man. Like being able to speak at schools, and especially in middle America, where it's like, like they can look at me and be like, I can be this guy, but they can't look at like my teammate who's 6'6" with a 47-inch vertical and be like, I can be him, but they can look at me and, like just some magical talks and experiences. But at every stop, like me and a few of my homies, like on the team, we would like crash the local college, and we'd play like a little pickup, And it was always like, oh, you're the show players. And then we'd go and we'd be like, no, you don't understand. Like, we got this. And, you know, so that competitiveness wasn't being filled where, you know, the impact on others was being filled. Yeah. And so, you know, the end of the first leg comes around and they're renegotiating contracts and they're talking about like, hey, we want you on the Alaskan tour. And there's, you know, there are multiple tours going on. So they handpick people to go to Alaska and all this stuff. And, you know, my now wife was at Johnson at the time, Lewis at the time, Jenna Lamica now. And, you know, I saved up enough money and I'm like, I got to marry this girl. And I'm like, and plus like they were talking about like multiple year contracts. And I'm like,
sure.
Like, you know, I don't know if I can play 7 nights a week traveling around in buses and hotels and, you know, that constant smile on my face where it's like, you know, and there was games where I'd get like fined because me and like some of the homies would be like, no, like you're not like, cause some people we played at Kentucky and it was like against University of Kentucky players, sure. They're not letting us put on a show. They're out there. They're like, we're going to try to get you. And so, you know, all that sort of stuff. But, at that time, an ABA team like reached out to me. This dude, Tracy from New York City was, you know, big in like the Rucker Park scene and all that sort of stuff. And he was coaching there and he's like, hey, like saw some of your stuff. Like, do you have interest in like playing competitively again? And that's kind of like all it took. And so I, you know, I flew back home, stayed with Jenna, proposed to her, got to watch her score 1,000 points. And like, she was just, I mean, she used to play pickup with the dudes like at Johnson. Sure. She'd play with us and just like more than hold her own and, you know, get under the skin of so many people that like, hey, this girl is out here dominating. And so, yeah, then we got married, went to the team in New York, the ABA team. And, you know, they really were wonderful. Like all the news channels and papers were like, oh, the AM1, like we have this AM1 guy coming to join. And, yeah. You know, so I think at first some of the players were like, they saw me and they're like, are you like, okay. And then, you know, Tracy would always joke. He's like, you know, whoever we have come in, like when we play against Chris, like Chris's team's always the one win. I'm like, cause I've always carried that chip. And then that kind of carried into the season. But with the same mindset that I've always had, like, even though I could score, I could shoot, like my 3-point percentage was like 48% and change in the pros. And, you know, but it was always so that and I had so many good athletes, you know, we had like 3 guys over 6'11", which at Johnson, you don't get, you know, and then our wingman was like 6'4" with a 40+ inch vert. And it was just like, the game got even easier as far as a passer, you know what I mean? And then like able to find those pockets where people are like expecting that pass or like threading the needle and people being ready for it. It was just a phenomenal experience. And then when I got named to the All-Star team, it was a big time, like emotional moment for me. You know, cause it's something you work so hard for and I think I was at the time the only Division III player in the league. And, you know, so I always took great pride in being from Johnson. Like I never was the person who like shied away and like, oh, I'm from this like little D3 school in Vermont. Like, no, I'm from Johnson State. Like, you don't understand. And they're like, oh yeah, I heard of it. I'm like, yeah, you have, because you haven't. But now you're going to remember that because of this. And yeah, man, it was just a really magical time. You know, and then at that time I was getting a lot of offers from like overseas teams, NBA D-League team, the Fort Wayne Mad Ants, like contacted me like, hey, if you're this guy we see on tape, we like want you down here. And I even told like the GM, I'm like, you're looking at the right Chris Lamica? And they're like, you're the only Chris Lamica we've ever heard of. And they're like, if you're the guy on tape, like we want you here. And then, you know, unfortunately in the ABA, we're in Kentucky, oddly enough. And we're in like the equivalent of like the Elite 8 of the NCAA tournament, because like how the ABA does it, they do like one and done. Like it's like a bracket playoff instead of like a best of 7 like the NBA. And so we're in Kentucky, you know, the third round or whatever, get this steal. Like I'm taking it down. I'm like, oh, I'm about to dunk on this guy and just get like wiped out, come down like full scorpion mode, like don't know what's going on. And somehow, and luckily Jenna was there too. And, you know, somehow I convinced the training staff to let me back in the game. And like the first shot I pull up from like half court and it's like 7 feet to the right.
Yeah.
And I'm just out there looking like, you know, somebody who just got knocked out. And so spent like the night in a Kentucky hospital. Next thing I remember, like Jenna's talking to me and I'm in one of those like scan machines and you know, was in a little neck thing for a minute. And yeah, so, you know, I'm not Kobe, you know, RIP, but you know, nobody's waiting for me to come back from a neck injury. Yeah. So some of the international teams were so interested, but there's places like after getting D-League stuff, it's like, you know, I can't bring my wife to some of these countries. Yeah. And, you know, I just physically wasn't responding and mentally how I wanted to. And so, yeah, that kind of like led to the end of that aspect of my life. But fortunately, like I was able to find, you know, especially with acting, like other passions that filled that. And
well, that's a great segue because Bob told me about you. I knew of you from Ozzy, but then when I interviewed Miles, he brought up your name. So then I was looking at you, and then this came up. I'm like, whoa, this is a basketball dude? And they're like, all right, I think this is the same Chris Lamica. Then I keep going, and then the acting really took off for you. It was just a pretty cool transition. Now, when did you know you wanted to take that route and just use your hair to pay the bills?
Bro, you ain't lying though. You ain't lying. No, so when I was done with basketball and, you know, Jen and I moved back to Vermont, I took a job as a kindergarten teacher for a year at Barnett School, which, you know, I loved. Like the people there were so welcoming, but there was such like a piece missing. And so I tried to fill it. I'm like, oh, golf. I can golf. Like all washed up athletes golf. So I golf, like third day I hit a hole in one. I'm like, oh, I'm Tiger. And then I'm like the next like 5 days, I'm like, oh, this sucks. Yeah. But I love it. I still like try to do it. Then I'm like, oh, snowboarding. Like I can be Shaun White, right? No, I mean, I can snowboard. I love it. Not Shaun White. And so at this time I was visiting one of my homies in Boston who worked for Ace Tickets, which is like the Celtics, Red Sox ticket master type of thing. And we were just kind of outside Fenway, and this dude came up to me, and he's like, you know, 3-piece suit, and he's like, "Hey, are you an actor?" And so I look at my book, I'm like, this dude must like be asking like for like adult film type of stuff, because I'm like, this is like the weirdest thing. And so I was like, nah, dude, I'm good. And then up in Burlington, kind of a similar thing happened, but it was somebody like more my age, and I was like, okay, this happens 2 times in the course of a month. Like maybe this is a path I should look into. So I went to this audition for, you know, the guy in Burlington, and it was, you know, this small role, and I never took an acting class, never was in a play. Like I knew nothing. So they kind of shred me. They're like, oh, you don't have a headshot and resume? Like we have people from New York and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, I don't know. I just have to be here. Like, let me do my thing. And then like, y'all can go your own way. And so I'm leaving, like I do my thing, leave, and they call me and they're like, hey, we think like maybe a bigger role. So I did that. And then from that, like the next project I knew, not that project, but the next project, I was in this movie shooting in New Hampshire with like Chevy Chase and Bonnie Wright from Harry Potter and all these people from Game of Thrones. It was like my second acting thing. And so that kind of like ignited in me, like maybe there's something here. So I hunted down an acting coach who was like a big time guy in LA, but moved to Vermont so he could marry his partner. And I told him like, hey, like, I'm an actor, like, want to work with me? And he's like, I don't really do that. I work with like Broadway people and like LA actors. Like, and he's like, but you can send me your stuff and I can kind of put you in contact with somebody. So I sent him, at that time, I finally got a headshot and had like this film, and I sent it to him, and he's like, yeah, like, you want to start working? And I'm like, I definitely want to start working. And so, you know, took over for basketball. I was like 5-6 days a week for 4 or 5 hours, like sometimes with him, and then researching. And it just really, I'm like, the same things that drew me to basketball can still be alive in this acting thing. Like maybe not the physicality of like having a ball in your hands, but still the physicality, the telling the story, the creativeness, the really like being able to connect with people. And with basketball, like that's the difference between a successful team and people who underachieve. I think it's synergy. It's all about how you're connecting. And I think good actors, that's what it is. It's connecting to someone through a camera. You know what I mean? And so I just went full steam ahead with that. And before I knew it, I had a talent agent out in LA, like came out to visit them, and they're like, oh, we see you as this like modern day James Dean. At the time, I had no idea who he is. I'm like, oh, sure, yeah, cool, bro, like awesome. And I'm come back, and Jenna's like, hey, you want to try this? I'm like, yeah. And then a few weeks later, we have a U-Haul in that she ordered, and she's like, all right, let's go to California. So that's kind of how the transition happened. Very unplanned, unanticipated. And for the first time in my life, like it was something that seemed to present itself without me trying to like, I'm going to kick the doors down. Like with basketball, it was like, I'm kicking down every door. Right. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm not supposed, like I'm cutting middle school till I'm too short. Like I'm not supposed to play on the high school team. Then after that, I'm like a small kid from the sticks. Like I'm not supposed to play in N1. Like I'm not supposed to turn down N1 and play in college. Like the first one in my family to go to college. Like, so I've always like been like a door kicker downer. And you know, with acting to start, it was like that, but then it's, you know, it's still the same, where it's like, it's so competitive. And that edge, I think, has allowed me to start later in life comparatively, you know, because there's people who have been out here since they were like 5 doing it. And I'm like, which I respect. Like, you know, I was the same way with basketball, but it's like, I need to be a harder worker than everybody else. I need to learn faster. I need to be more adaptable. I need to be stronger in like my acting choices, or else they're just going to overlook me. And so I think just going into everything with that mindset of like, you know, I need to make this happen, and I need to be different, and I need to, you know, be me, and I need to be passionate and driven. Like that also applies to acting, and sometimes even more so than with basketball, to be honest.
Well, it's really good because with basketball, it's kind of the law of the familiar. You know what you've done, you know what you need to do, but with acting, it's just a wide open door of opportunity, and you kind of just step through it and learn along the way. You're 100%. Building that plane as it's in the air. What have you learned?
I love that analogy, bro. That's awesome.
What have you learned most about yourself? Is it the fact that you need to be resilient and that's always been your MO, or is there something different that you've really discovered as you've gotten older?
Great question. So the thing I've come to realize is all the things that made me special, even if it's in my own mind, but special, you know, on the court and in life, can still be active here. So I don't think necessarily learning anything new, as opposed to like, hey, this is an attribute that I now have that I didn't have. And it's just, you know, what kind of adult do I want to be?
Sure.
You know, I want to be the person who can influence and inspire and, you know, make people feel things, you know, and I think part of that is just also being an active human. Yeah. You know, I think when we're younger, we're so self-consumed, and, you know, on the court, it was like, if somebody took me out, I'm like, how could you take me out? You know what I mean? It's like, this is, you know, you get fired up, and that kind of is, but now it's like, you know, I still have that aspect, but instead of it being about me, as far as that, it would be now like, okay, what was I doing that wasn't helpful, that can change, whether it was something I said or did. And I think as an adult, it's just being a good listener, being an active human, being emotionally there for people, and, you know, trying to still be that inspiration in whatever way I can, while staying completely loyal to the person I think I am. And I think, like, at this point, kind of like you were saying, it's like, I think you're a track record of like your actions, like you're a track record of your actions. So you're like, I'm this because of the choices I've made along the way. And I think that's really important to understand, because so often we can get dogged down and like, hey, you know, because we all can have negative self-thoughts of like, oh, I'm not this, I'm not that as a person, like I could be better. But it's like, no, you're the summary of your actions, not how you're necessarily internally feeling.
Right.
And I think, and I mean, just based on the, you know, what I've looked up about you and the stuff you've done, it seems like you can 100% relate to that. And, you know, with everything that you're into.
Oh, for sure. And I think John Maxwell, he's a leadership guy, and he says experience isn't the best teacher, or that would mean all the old people would be the wisest. And you look at our country, but he says evaluated experience is the best
Yes.
teacher. And I agree with that. Hey, I just want to hit on this project,
100%.
Everything You Are movie.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about this.
Yeah. So basically, when I first moved out here, the first audition I went to was like this Target commercial, and they're like, "Hey, dance!" They're like literally dance in this room full of like with like kids holding up their present, and I'm like, you know what? If this is gonna be like, I need to find a team that while I do these other projects, that we're creating art that we see as art that we love, that we're passionate about. So along the way, I've been able to get some people, actors, cinematographers, directors, blah blah blah, that have formed a team. So while I'm doing things like NCIS LA, SWAT, Lucifer, all these things, that they're amazing roles, but there's always that part creatively that you're like, ooh, I want to kind of get outside my comfort zone. And, like I've been cast a lot as like the bad boy type of stuff out here. And I'm like, I want to see like what this looks like with different levels. So, got with some friends of mine to create this project, and this movie, Everything You Are, has just like really kind of took in a life of its own. And so many people that I've met along the way that are just like, hey, we want to be involved. Like people that are so talented that it's like, just make this story that we created together really come to life and really pop. And it's right there on the verge of being released. It's just now with everything being shut down, it's a matter of like, what platform do we want to release? How do we want to release it? What is the best way to go about doing it? Because a lot of the film festivals now are being shut down. So that kind of avenue is different. But this is like such a passion project. And some of my really good friends who I met along like we have an actress in it who she was one of the characters in La La Land. We have an actor from Days of Our Lives. People, I mean, I can run down the list, and everybody has done something, and they wanted to jump on board and do this project. And I couldn't be more proud. It's a kind of dark, twisted story that kind of goes into like mental illness, but also with like interracial relationships and the problem, not necessarily problems, but the difficulties with those sort of things. And, how somebody sees something is not necessarily how another person does. So we're trying just to marry those reality.
It's really good.
And yeah, it's a really, I love it. I'll have to make sure to get it in your hands when I can, because it's something. Yeah. It's awesome.
Hey, so when I was on radio about, I don't know, 9 years ago, 10 years ago, whenever it was, whenever the red light came on, I was always so nervous until my friend just said, Jeff, be the same person off air that you are on air. Now, I was asked if I was in a movie, would I want to play the hero or the villain? And I said, being a pastor vocationally, I would definitely want to be the villain in a movie. But how do you balance being on air with a camera on versus just being yourself as well?
Awesome question. And I think that's the biggest key to being an effective actor. And I don't even mean successful, financially rich or anything. I just mean being somebody who can reach people, is being able to bring humanity to your character and then bringing it through the lens. And, this is a trick that I've figured, and it's just always worked for me, because, like when I'm on any set, I mean, even like the NCIS LA, which was the most recent one I did, it's like, we're having explosions and we're having 4 cameras on you, and you look over and you're like, oh, there's LL Cool J, and like, you're doing all these things, and they're like, okay, you get like 1 take to do this, or like a few takes because things are blowing up. And you have 20 people in hair and makeup, you have costume people making sure the gun's on you. So all these things can be very distracting. And then when they say action, you're supposed to just deliver, which is our job, so we have to do that. But it's like the thing I found, the kind of trick like that, is once I like prior to action, just thinking of like, what do I want these people to feel? And it's different than most actors. Like most actors are like, oh, how can I influence the other actor? I'm almost like, what do I want the people watching this to feel? And how can I convey that? So to get it completely off me. Because if I'm thinking about the things I'm doing, like what my hand's doing or where my eyes are, I'm in my head, and then I'm not being truthful and honest. And I think, great acting or the stories that move us, whether it's TV or even commercials or whatever, it's like, I think it's that honesty. And I think that's kind of why everybody cries during like the dog commercials, like cause it's like, they're so just honest. There's no,
Right.
you know, they're hurt or they're happy, and it's just so truthful and so deep and so real. It's not this like fake, you know, this fake, like, hey, I'm an actor saying my lines, you know? So it's just, so I always found it like, what am I, like, anything I can do to get the attention off me from my own mind, while also knowing like the attention has to be on me because of the camera. So you can't just sit there and be, you know, all kind of inactive, but it's just finding that. And then, you know, as far as like, there's times where that doesn't work, and I just try to find like a spot, like literally something away from everything that I can just like visually focus on. And then even if I'm delivering my lines to their pre-record and then go to I just find any sort of little distraction like that where I can just take a moment, get into what I want to portray, is kind of just where it's at.
Yeah, that's real good. And you definitely have some headshots now, as is pictured behind me. So during this pandemic, I just said off air, Vermont, we've done well. And we have a lot of space, some Vermont rednecks that keep to themselves. No disrespect. That's just how we live.
Love Vermont, man. Love my Vermonter.
How have you been able to survive and get through this pandemic with so many uncertainties? Like you said, with the Everything You Are movie and some of the projects you would like to do, how are you just grinding?
I think, like, first and foremost, I am lucky to, you know, have tremendous wife who takes care of our finances. So like with basketball money or like movie money comes through, and it's like she's handling it. So we're very lucky to be doing that. And she's a phenomenal like school teacher at a private school. And so and you know, with like acting, like residuals and stuff, that's fine. So a lot of people, and it's terrible to think about and see, it's like people are losing health insurance, people are losing their jobs, people, you know, are close to being evicted once some of these policies, you know, finish up. And so on one hand, we're incredibly lucky, and I think, you know, I don't have any kids or anything, but do have 2 dogs that I love. But it's just like staying focused on like the here and now, like not necessarily trying, like instead of being like overwhelmed with like, oh man, we might not film anything this year, right. Or like, you know, like without any show, you don't know if you're being brought back. So like NCISLA, like, you know, hoping that we get a chance to expand on that story. And now it's like, oh, if some time passes, like, are we not going to revisit this, or right. Those sort of things. So instead of focusing on those, I try to focus on like tangible short-term things. Like, what can I do for my mental health? What can I do for my physical health? Like, what can I do to be the best husband? What can I do to be a great friend? What, you know, family member, like my grandfather recently passed away, and it's like, what can I do to be a good family member to my grandmother who's still there, who's now trapped in Vermont in a, sure. You know, an adult home, essentially, like what can I do to kind of be just a good human and be there for others and kind of service outside of myself in many ways. Like obviously the self-care, you know, keeping in shape and keeping all that stuff, but it's like just trying to find things to do that are outside myself, that are, because it's such a beautiful time to be able to connect if, you know, because we're all kind of like settled down away from it. And as far as, you know, we're not allowed to go and be that rat in the wheel right now. And so I think for those people who are fortunate enough to be able to use this as an opportunity to reconnect with kids or family, like things that you're not, and I'm sure you can relate as a father. It's like, I'm sure there's experiences now that you're going to look back on, you're gonna be like, you know, as much as that sucked and it was terrible, it's like, not that some good could come out, because I wish this would never have happened, because it's ruining so many people's lives, and it's terrible. And we could get into a 10-hour conversation about why that is. And that's, you know, something I've become passionate about. But, you know, I think with anything, no matter how difficult, it's like trying to find that silver lining of like, what from this can be taken out positive, because adversity sucks and we all go through it, and it punches you in the face when you least expect it, and it's overwhelming. But it's like trying to find that silver lining. And, you know, I think that's it. Like the human, so being connected with people on a human level in ways like maybe like you weren't able to do when you're every single day out there, you know? And yeah, I mean, I like I was saying with you, with your kids, it's like, that must be such a magical, like there's some experiences that you would miss out probably on if you weren't around them all the time right now, you know?
Oh, it's so true. And my son just graduated high school. My daughter's going into her junior year. And just a quick story, probably a stretch, a bad analogy, but if you play in a bad team, like in Vermont high school, and there's no leap that I played with, there are no leapers. It was fun to do like a fancy, entertaining pass that led to a layup, because you couldn't throw a lob, and what good is a layup? So you just got to do something a little bit more during that time of monotony. But Chris, thanks so much for making the time.
Yeah, man, pleasure. It's been a blast, man. I hope, you know, you and your kids keep having those wonderful memories during this, and hopefully, you know, because they're at big times in their life. So hopefully you have some things that years go by, you can look back and be like, oh, that was a wonderful time to spend together.
Yeah, man, jumping Bingham Falls, as we've been doing a little bit, and some of those lots of memories with my son. So when you get back to Vermont, look me up. I'll take you out for dinner. And thanks again for making the time.
Awesome. Thanks you for having me, brother.
Yeah, again, that's Chris Lamica. You can find him. Well, just Google him. You'll get that headshot, and then you'll get much more. Chris Lamica joining me at J. Fuller.